51 drones, one single night, and the most sophisticated air defense system money can buy almost broke. Right now, as you are watching this video, the Gulf region, the beating heart of the world's energy supply, is under attack. Not in some distant future, not in a war game simulation, not in a think tank report warning about what might happen if tensions continue to rise. Right now, tonight, as you sit watching this screen, cities that were built to be untouchable are receiving missile alerts on civilian phones. Oil refineries that keep your fuel prices stable are on fire. A body of water so critical that 1/3 of the world's entire liquefied natural gas supply passes through it. Every single day has gone almost completely silent. And the governments that spent hundreds of billions of dollars over multiple decades promising their citizens that this could never happen, that the system was solid, the deterrence was real, the guarantees were ironclad, are sitting in emergency sessions right now trying to explain why it is happening anyway. Trying to explain why the architecture they sold as impenetrable has cracks in it large enough to fly 51 drones through. But here's the part the media is not telling you. The part that is buried under the breaking news tickers and the expert panels and the geopolitical theater and the carefully managed press briefings that tell you what the governments involved want you to understand and nothing more. While governments were signing billion-dollar defense deals, while F-35 jets were being promised to allies who had never faced a real modern war on their own soil, while Washington was patting itself on the back for building a security architecture in the Middle East that it described as historic and transformational and unprecedented, Iran was already 3 steps ahead. Already studying the gaps in that architecture with patient precision, already mapping the exact weaknesses that would make it fail when the moment came, already designing the attack methodology that the system was never actually built to stop. And the bill for that gap between the promises and the reality is now being paid not by generals or politicians or defense contractors who collected the commissions on those deals. It is being paid by the global economy, by your gas prices, by your food supply, by the retirement accounts and the grocery budgets and the heating bills and the electricity costs of ordinary people across the world who have nothing to do with any of this, who never voted for any of this, who never asked to be part of it, and who are going to pay for it regardless. And at the very end of this video, we are going to show you the one number that reveals just how catastrophic the decision-making behind this conflict truly was. 6 days, $11.3 billion, and a letter signed by over 250 organizations that is shaking the foundations of Washington right now and asking questions that nobody in power seems capable of answering honestly. Stay with us. Because by the time this video ends, the way you think about Middle East security, about who it actually protects, about who paid for it, about who was really buying and who was really being sold, will never be the same again. Let us go back to where this all started. Because to understand what is happening in the Gulf today, you have to understand the architecture of assumptions that was constructed over the last decade and a half. A structure so elegant in its logic, so carefully maintained by defense contractors and foreign policy, think tanks, and media organizations, with deep institutional ties to the national security establishment, that most people genuinely believed the story being told. That the Middle East was moving towards something resembling stability, that the Abraham Accords had changed the fundamental calculus of the region, that Iran was contained and weakening under the sustained pressure of international sanctions, that the era of major regional conflict was behind us, and that the future was one of gradual normalization, expanding economic cooperation, and a Middle East being slowly but surely anchored into the Western-led international system. It was not behind us. It was loading. For years, the United States sold the Gulf states a very specific and very compelling vision of what security looked like and what it would cost. The pitch was always the same, delivered through diplomatic channels and arms fair brochures, and defense cooperation agreements drafted in careful legal language. You want protection from Iran? Buy our weapon systems. You want credible deterrence against missile attacks? Sign a defense cooperation agreement and let us station our forces on your soil. You want Iran to back down permanently, to look at the regional balance of power and conclude that aggression is strategically irrational? Get in line behind Israel, normalize relations with Tel Aviv, build the architecture of a new regional alliance, show a united front, and trust the system that America has spent decades and trillions of dollars constructing and perfecting. Saudi Arabia spent hundreds of billions of dollars on that vision, not as a figure of speech. Literally hundreds of billions in defense procurement spread across multiple decades and multiple administrations in both Riyadh and Washington. Fighter aircraft, missile defense systems, surveillance and intelligence platforms, military training programs, command and control infrastructure. The list is long and the invoices are staggering. The UAE built one of the most expensive integrated air defense networks per square mile anywhere on the planet. A layered system of overlapping radar coverage, multiple tiers of interceptor missiles, and sophisticated command and control architecture that cost more per protected square kilometer than almost any comparable installation in military history. Bahrain hosted the United States Fifth Fleet, transforming a small island nation into one of the most strategically significant American forward operating positions in the entire world. Qatar housed the Al Udeid Air Base, one of the single most important American military installations anywhere on Earth, a facility from which operations across the entire Central Command theater have been planned and coordinated for more than 2 decades. These countries did not just buy American promises in a casual or transactional sense. They restructured the foundations of their foreign policy around those promises. They built their long-term economic growth models on the explicit assumption that the security environment would remain stable enough to attract the international capital flows, the tourism revenues, the corporate headquarters relocations, and the kind of sustained foreign direct investment that was supposed to transform resource-dependent Gulf economies into diversified modern economies, less vulnerable to the swings of oil prices. They structured their international image, the brand that Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh had invested billions in building for a global audience around the idea that they were under an American security umbrella that would hold no matter what happened in the broader region. That no matter how provocative the rhetoric coming from Tehran, no matter how many drones the Houthis launched from Yemen, no matter how many times Iranian officials talked about closing the Strait of Hormuz, the fundamental equation could not be broken. America's commitment, plus American technology, plus Gulf oil money equaled a deterrence environment that Iran simply could not afford to challenge in any serious way. That equation is being tested in real time right now, and some very serious, very uncomfortable, very inconvenient questions are being asked about whether it was ever as strong as it was sold to be, or whether the advertising was always significantly better than the product being advertised. Here is what actually happened in the days leading up to the current crisis, and why the sequence of events matters far more than any single dramatic headline. The moment that changed everything was not one military strike happening in isolation. It was a series of decisions accumulated over years inside both Washington and Jerusalem that built toward a strategic posture that made some form of major confrontation with Iran essentially inevitable given Iranian domestic politics and the ideological commitments of the Islamic Republic. The specific trigger that activated the current crisis was a coordinated campaign of American and Israeli airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear development infrastructure and military command architecture. The stated objectives were clear and had been consistently stated for years by officials on both sides. Degrade Iran's nuclear program below the threshold of weapons capability, neutralize the ballistic missile arsenals that had been pointed at Israel and at Gulf states for decades, and fundamentally shift the strategic balance of the region in favor of the alliance system that America had spent so much capital constructing. In pure military terms, the strikes were described by American and Israeli officials as highly effective operations. Key nuclear facilities were struck and degraded. Command and control structures were disrupted in significant ways. Missile production capacity was set back substantially. And in one of the most consequential intelligence revelations to emerge from the conflict, one that received, remarkably, fairly muted and brief coverage in the Western mainstream media before being moved off. The front page by the next development, United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth confirmed publicly that Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who had only recently inherited the position and was still establishing his internal authority, had been wounded in the course of the strikes. Wounded, and in Hegseth's own precise words, likely disfigured. Take a moment with that fact, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that has happened since. The supreme leader of one of the most powerful states in the Middle East, a man who sits atop a ballistic missile arsenal that is the largest in the region by any measurement, a man with deep ideological relationships, financial ties, and command authority over every major non-state armed group from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen, to the extensive militia networks that operate across Iraq and Syria, and that give Iran strategic reach far beyond its own borders. A man whose political legitimacy within the Iranian governing system rests not just on his inherited religious authority, but on his embodiment of the Islamic Republic's foundational resistance identity, the idea that Iran stands against imperial aggression and will not be broken by it. That man was wounded in a strike carried out by Israel, supported by the United States, wounded in a way that is reportedly visible on his body, permanently. Every analyst who has spent serious time studying Iranian political culture and the decision-making dynamics of the Islamic Republic's governing system will tell you the same thing without hesitation. There is no scenario in which that fact does not produce a response. There is no version of the political calculation inside Tehran where absorbing that blow quietly, or going silent after that level of public humiliation, is a survivable political choice for whoever is managing the transition of power inside the Iranian system. Because in the political theology that has governed the Islamic Republic since its founding in 1979, silence after that kind of humiliation is not restraint or de-escalation. It is surrender. And surrender, in the language and the operational logic that runs through every institution of the Iranian state, is not merely a strategic failure. It is an existential threat to the regime's legitimacy, to its narrative, to the foundational justification for its existence, and for the sacrifices it has demanded from the Iranian population for nearly 5 decades. So the response was never a question of whether. The only questions were of timing, of target selection, of the scale and the methodology that would maximize the strategic and psychological impact, while staying below whatever threshold the Iranian leadership calculated would trigger the most devastating American military response. And the answers to those questions, when they came in the form of drones over Saudi Arabia and missiles aimed at Dubai and strikes on Qatari and Bahraini infrastructure, were designed to accomplish one specific strategic objective that the Iranian military establishment had spent years carefully preparing for: overwhelming the defensive architecture of the Gulf states through coordinated, simultaneous, multi-directional, high-volume attacks precisely calibrated to push the systems toward and ideally beyond their operational limits. The doctrine has a name in military analysis: saturation. The logic is simple in concept, even if extraordinarily complex in execution. You do not need to be stronger than the defense, you need to be more numerous. You flood the air defense systems with incoming threats at a rate, and from a set of directions that exceeds what the systems can process and engage simultaneously. Because every interceptor missile in a Patriot battery has a minimum response time and a reload cycle. Every radar system has a finite number of tracks it can hold and process simultaneously. Every air defense command center has a maximum cognitive load beyond which the humans operating it begin to make mistakes under the stress of simultaneous engagement decisions. And if you can generate incoming threats at a rate that exceeds those limits, not dramatically, not in a way that requires overwhelming resources, just marginally, at the right moment, from the right mix of angles, you create gaps. And in air defense, gaps are catastrophic because what comes through the gap does not just cause physical damage. It proves the concept. It demonstrates that the system can be broken. And that demonstration changes everything about how adversaries, allies, and financial markets calculate risk. On the night that 51 drones appeared over Saudi Arabian airspace, not from a single direction, but from multiple approach vectors, not at a single altitude, but across a range that complicated engagement sequencing, including in the skies near Riyadh itself, the saturation doctrine was tested against the most expensive and theoretically capable air defense network the Gulf states have ever deployed, and the Patriot batteries fired. And the intercepts happened, and by the morning the official statements said 51 targets destroyed, 0 penetration, system performed, success. That is what the media reported. Saudi Arabia intercepted 51 drones in a single night. The air defense is held. Deterrence working. But listen to what that framing is actually doing. Because 51 drones in one night over Saudi Arabian territory is not, in the operational language of modern drone warfare doctrine, an attack designed to cause maximum destruction. It is a diagnostic exercise conducted at scale against real systems under real operational conditions to collect data that no simulation, no training exercise, no intelligence assessment of published technical specifications can provide. Every drone that was fired taught the planners on the other side something specific and valuable. The ones that were intercepted at maximum range told them where the radar coverage is strongest and where the battery positions are. The ones that were engaged closer in told them where the coverage weakens at lower altitudes or certain approach angles. The timing patterns of the intercept events mapped the response cycles of the individual battery systems and the command coordination between them. Any drone that created a moment of processing overload in the command system identified the cognitive stress threshold that future attack planning can try to exceed. Every single one of the 51 drones, whether it was destroyed 20 kilometers out or 5 kilometers out, generate intelligence about the actual operational performance of Saudi air defenses under real combat conditions. Intelligence that is now being analyzed. Intelligence that will be used to design the next attack, which will be larger, more carefully structured, to exploit the specific gaps identified in the first one, and which will arrive at a time and from a combination of vectors that the defenders cannot reliably predict. This is what is being missed in the coverage that celebrates 51 interceptions as a clear and complete success. The success was real. The drones were destroyed. But the exercise accomplished its primary purpose anyway, because the primary purpose was not to destroy things in Saudi Arabia. It was to learn how Saudi Arabia defends itself. And that learning is now complete, cataloged, and being incorporated into future planning. Now, while Saudi Arabia was absorbing its drone diagnostic exercise in the north, something was happening 800 kilometers to the southeast that stopped the world's most aggressively marketed city dead in its tracks. For a few hours, that will reverberate in boardrooms and investment committees for years. Dubai, the city that genuinely never stops. The city that built the world's tallest building and an indoor ski slope in the middle of the desert and the most ambitious artificial archipelago in the history of human construction. The city that has functioned for 3 decades as the most convincing argument that it is possible to build a stable, prosperous, cosmopolitan, genuinely modern city in the heart of one of the world's most politically volatile regions. The city that hosts the largest gold trading market in the world, that processes more international financial transactions than most European financial centers, that has attracted more corporate regional headquarters than any other Middle Eastern location by offering a combination of infrastructure, regulatory simplicity, and the one thing that all of that infrastructure and regulation ultimately depends on: safety. The absolute, bankable, financeable, insurable proposition that Dubai is safe. That the chaos and the conflict and the instability that have defined so much of the surrounding region for so long do not apply here. That the premium you pay to operate in Dubai, the higher rents and the visa costs and the expense of relocating executives and their families, is worth it because of the security dividend. Because things that happen elsewhere in the region do not happen here. On March 14th, 2026, residents of Dubai received emergency alerts on their mobile phones warning of incoming missile fire. People in shopping malls and hotel restaurants and glass-walled office towers overlooking the Gulf, ordinary residents, tourists, business travelers, financial sector professionals in the middle of their working day, felt their phones vibrate with the kind of notification that cities in conflict zones receive, and that Dubai had always been sold as the place that was definitionally exempt from. The air defense systems around the city engaged incoming targets. A building in the vicinity of the Dubai International Financial District was struck, and for the first time in its modern history as a global city, Dubai experienced the thing its entire brand was built to prevent: credible, documented, physical evidence that it is not beyond the reach of regional conflict. The financial implications of that single evening extend far beyond the physical damage caused by any single missile. Dubai's economic model depends on something that economists call a confidence premium. International companies pay more to operate in Dubai than they would pay in alternative regional locations, precisely because they are paying for the confidence that comes with stability. That confidence is priced into lease rates and labor costs and insurance premiums and the strategic planning assumptions that go into long-term investment decisions. And the confidence premium exists only as long as the underlying confidence exists. The moment a missile alert is sent to residents near the financial district, every element of that confidence calculation changes for every decision maker who is relying on it. Every chief financial officer of every multinational with regional headquarters in Dubai is now running a risk reassessment that was not being run 6 months ago. Every sovereign wealth fund with significant real estate or infrastructure assets in the Emirates is updating its scenario models to include variables that had previously been assigned near zero probability. Every insurance underwriter that covers personnel and assets in the UAE is reviewing exposure limits and repricing risk in ways that will show up in the premiums paid by every company and individual operating there. These are not hypothetical consequences existing only in theoretical models. They are the predictable mechanical responses of rational financial actors to new empirical information about risk. And the new information is not small, it is fundamental. The damage to Dubai's brand as the definitively safe Middle Eastern city is real, measurable, and will persist long after any military ceasefire is signed. Because brand damage of this specific type, damage to a safety proposition rather than damage to a quality or value proposition, heals on a different timeline from other kinds of reputational harm. Dubai cannot repair this damage by building another spectacular project or hosting another high-profile event. It can only repair it by demonstrating, through an extended period of uninterrupted calm, that the fundamental safety proposition has been restored. And that demonstration requires conditions: regional security, Iranian restraint, functional deterrence, that are currently absent and will not be restored quickly. While Saudi Arabia and the UAE were managing their respective crises, a diplomatic catastrophe was unfolding in the most unlikely of places. The country that had worked harder and more consistently than almost any other to maintain a working relationship with Iran. The country that had sacrificed significant political capital within the Gulf Cooperation Council to preserve the back channels and the diplomatic contacts and the quiet conversations that were supposed to make exactly this kind of attack both unnecessary and unthinkable. Qatar, a peninsula the size of a small American state, home to one of the highest per capita incomes anywhere on Earth precisely because it sits atop the North Field, the largest natural gas reservoir in the world, shared with Iran's South Pars Field on the other side of the maritime boundary. Qatar had spent years cultivating a uniquely complex diplomatic position. It hosted American military forces at Al Udeid, while simultaneously maintaining political channels with groups that those same American forces were fighting elsewhere. It had refused to join the Saudi-led blockade of its own territory without breaking relationships on either side. It had funded and operated Al Jazeera as a platform that criticized governments throughout the region, including governments that were critical to its own security, because it believed that being seen as an honest broker required accepting the costs of independence. Qatar had calculated that its value as a neutral party, as the country everyone called when official channels were closed and someone needed to talk to someone else without admitting they were doing so, gave it a kind of protection through indispensability. Iran struck it anyway. When the Qatari prime minister used the word betrayal to describe what Iran had done, the specific choice of language communicated something deeper than a diplomatic complaint. He did not reach for the language of international law or condemnation or aggression. He reached for the language of personal hurt, betrayal. Because Qatar had invested years of careful, costly diplomacy in maintaining a relationship with Tehran that was supposed to make this impossible. Not impossible in a military sense. Qatar has no illusions about its ability to defend itself without allies, but impossible in a political and relational sense. The idea that Iran would strike a country that had worked so hard to remain on good terms, that had preserved communication channels when others closed them, that had refused to join the regional coalition that was most openly hostile to Iranian interests, that was the betrayal. The security Qatar had purchased was not hardware, it was relationship. And the relationship failed to protect it when it mattered most. The consequences for global energy markets were immediate, severe, and geographically vast. Qatar is not a peripheral player in global LNG markets. It is one of the largest exporters in the world, with long-term supply contracts, linking it to customers in Japan, South Korea, China, India, Germany, Italy, France, the United Kingdom, and dozens of other economies that have built significant portions of their energy supply planning around Qatari deliveries. When the strikes disrupted Qatari production and the force majeure clauses in those contracts were triggered, the news moved through global energy trading rooms and government energy ministries like an electric current. European governments that had spent years rebuilding their energy security strategies around increased Qatari LNG imports, specifically because those imports were supposed to replace the Russian gas they could no longer rely on, suddenly found themselves facing a simultaneous disruption to the supply they had designated as the safe alternative. The phrase simultaneous disruption matters here in a way that demands explanation. The global energy system does not fail gracefully. It is not designed with the kind of redundancy that allows any single major supply source to go offline without significant cascading effects across the markets it serves. It functions well under normal conditions because it assumes that disruptions will be geographically isolated, that a problem in one producing country can be covered by increasing output elsewhere, that storage buffers can absorb short-term gaps, that spot markets can redirect available cargoes. All of those assumptions break down when the disruption is not a single country or single facility, but an entire regional system. When multiple major producers across the Gulf are simultaneously dealing with infrastructure strikes, when the shipping route that connects them all to their customers is simultaneously under threat, and when the insurance and logistics infrastructure that makes commercial energy shipping function normally has simultaneously priced the risk so high that many operators have suspended operations. That is the situation in the Strait of Hormuz right now. And the Strait of Hormuz is where the story of military conflict becomes the story of economic catastrophe at a scale that is genuinely unprecedented in the post-Cold War period. 21 miles at its narrowest point. That is the width of the channel through which 17 million barrels of oil flow every single day, through which a third of the world's liquefied natural gas moves on its way to the customers who depend on it, through which the energy that powers the manufacturing economies of Japan and South Korea and China and India makes its daily journey from the wells and the processing plants and the loading terminals of the Gulf to the tankers that carry it across the world's oceans. The Strait of Hormuz is the most consequential 21 miles of water on Earth for the functioning of the modern global economy, and it has effectively gone quiet. Iran has not issued a blockade declaration. That would constitute an unambiguous act of war against every nation that depends on the waterway, and would almost certainly trigger the kind of multinational military response that even Iran's current wounded and defiant leadership would have to think very carefully about absorbing. But there is a level of effective disruption that can be achieved below the formal blockade threshold, a level at which the practical effects on shipping volumes are nearly identical to a blockade, while the political and legal situation remains ambiguous enough to complicate the response. Iran has spent years developing and refining the specific capabilities needed to operate at exactly that level of disruption. Fast attack boats that can approach and threaten commercial vessels without necessarily destroying them. Anti-ship missile batteries positioned along the Iranian coastline that can hold any transiting vessel at risk. Drone systems capable of surveilling and harassing commercial traffic. Naval mines that can be rapidly deployed across shipping lanes and that require painstaking, time-consuming clearance operations before any vessel can safely transit. The combination of these capabilities, used together in a sustained and coordinated way, creates a threat environment that commercial shipping operators and their insurers have to respond to rationally, even if the threat never crosses into direct attack. The response has been rational and it has been dramatic. War risk insurance premiums for vessels attempting to enter the Gulf through the Strait have reached levels that multiple market sources describe as among the highest ever documented for any commercial shipping route in modern maritime history. Tanker operators who between them move, the majority of Gulf petroleum exports, have announced suspension of operations in the region pending security reassessment, joining a growing list of commercial operators who have concluded that the premium charged by insurers to cover a Gulf transit has made the voyage economically non-viable. The maritime tracking services that monitor global commercial shipping movements in real time have documented a reduction in Strait transit volume that is visible and significant and growing. The ships that normally create a dense, constant stream of commercial traffic through one of the most closely watched waterways on Earth are simply not there in the numbers that they should be. The downstream effects of this disruption move through the global economic system in ways that are sometimes immediate and visible. Oil prices moving sharply on commodity exchanges, energy stocks surging, airline fuel cost projections being revised upward in real time, and sometimes slow and systemic, the kind of damage that takes months to fully manifest, but that, when it does, shows up everywhere at once. The food security dimension of a sustained Strait disruption is the slow, systemic kind. The Gulf region and countries adjacent to it are major producers and exporters of nitrogen-based fertilizers, the ammonia and urea compounds that modern industrial agriculture depends on absolutely to maintain the crop yields that feed the current global population. These fertilizers move through Gulf shipping routes to agricultural markets across South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. When Gulf shipping is disrupted, fertilizer exports are disrupted. And when fertilizer exports are disrupted, the effect does not show up in food prices for the current season because the fertilizer for this season's planting was already applied. It shows up next season, and the season after. It accumulates, and it accelerates food price inflation in exactly the countries that are least able to absorb it, in exactly the populations that spend the highest percentage of their income on food, and that have the least buffer to absorb price shocks without descending into genuine food insecurity. Global financial markets have not waited for the agricultural cycle to play out before registering the scale of the risk. Equity markets across every major economy have experienced sustained, significant volatility since the conflict escalated to its current intensity. The pattern of market movement has followed the classic crisis playbook. Energy sector stocks surging as oil price expectations ratchet upward, while the broader market sells off as investors price in the cost implications for every industry that consumes energy or depends on supply chains that run through the Gulf. Airlines are facing fuel cost projections that were simply not in their financial models 6 months ago. Shipping and logistics companies are absorbing route disruption costs and insurance premium increases that compress margins to near zero or below on Gulf-adjacent routes. Consumer goods manufacturers are revising their cost structures upward to account for energy, input cost increases that will, with varying lags, make their way into the prices of finished goods in retail environments everywhere those goods are sold. Bond markets, which function as the most honest real-time measure of institutional investor assessment of economic and financial system risk, have shown the flight to safety behavior that historically accompanies genuine, sustained economic concern rather than the kind of temporary market volatility that resolves itself in days or weeks as the specific source of uncertainty is clarified. Capital is moving into government securities and gold and other traditional safe harbor instruments in volumes, and with the kind of conviction that signals professional money management organizations are positioning for a scenario in which the disruption is not temporary, not quickly resolved, not a storm that will pass in a week and allow markets to recover to their pre-crisis levels. Currency markets in the Gulf have their own dynamic. The major Gulf currencies, the Saudi Riyal, the UAE dirham, the Qatari Riyal, are pegged to the US dollar, which provides exchange rate stability that insulates them from the most immediate manifestations of currency pressure. But the peg is a financial instrument sustained by foreign currency reserves and political will, not a physical force of nature. It holds as long as the government maintains the reserves to defend it and the political capacity to absorb the economic costs of doing so. Foreign currency reserves are generated by energy export revenue. When oil infrastructure is burning and gas production is disrupted and tanker traffic has stopped and energy revenue is collapsing, the fiscal foundations that support the currency peg are being eroded in ways that do not show up in the exchange rate today, but that create cumulative fiscal pressure that finance ministries across the Gulf are quietly managing with growing concern. Into this economic landscape, the question of the defense deals and the security architecture returns with full force. Because the economic damage being absorbed right now, the burning refineries, the disrupted gas production, the stopped tankers, the capital flight, the brand damage to Gulf cities, is precisely the damage that hundreds of billions of dollars in American military equipment and American security commitments was sold as preventing. The investment was not sold as limiting Iranian aggression. It was sold as deterring it, not containing the damage from attacks, preventing the attacks from happening. And measured against that specific promise, the one actually made in diplomatic language and defense cooperation agreements and arms deal justifications, the system has failed to deliver. Now we arrive at the dimension of this crisis that the mainstream Western media has most conspicuously failed to integrate into its analysis: the Russian dimension. The coordination between Moscow and Tehran that transforms this from a regional conflict into a front in a much larger global confrontation between two fundamentally incompatible visions of international order. The United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary made a statement in the course of the current crisis that was remarkable for its directness, and that deserves a level of analytical attention far beyond what it has received. She said clearly, in public remarks, that Moscow and Tehran are actively supporting each other in the current crisis, that they are working in coordination to exploit the disruption to the global economy for mutual strategic benefit, that the Russia-Iran relationship has evolved beyond two isolated sanctioned states finding common cause against common adversaries into something that functions as a genuine operational partnership with real depth in specific military and economic domains. The military dimension of this partnership is concrete, documented, and consequential for understanding what the Gulf states are actually facing. Iran's drone capabilities, the saturation attack methodology being used to probe Saudi air defenses, the precision strike capability being used to hit Qatari and Bahraini infrastructure, the harassment and surveillance capabilities being deployed against Gulf shipping, have been substantially upgraded through the exchange of technology, expertise, and real-world operational experience with Russia. Iran supplied Russia with large numbers of Shahed series drones for use in Ukraine. Russia has shared advances in guidance systems, electronic warfare, and manufacturing efficiency that have been incorporated into Iranian production programs. Both countries have been learning from the operational performance of Iranian-designed drones in the most extensive real-world drone combat environment in history, the Ukrainian conflict, and incorporating those lessons into the development of next-generation capabilities. This is the threat model that Gulf state defense procurement was never honestly calibrated against. The planning scenarios that underpinned every F-35 sale and every Patriot battery installation and every defense cooperation agreement were built around a solo Iran, a sanctioned Iran operating on its indigenous technological base, resource-constrained, technologically limited, strategically isolated, an adversary that was manageable in the conventional threat assessment framework that defense contractors use to justify their products. The problem is that the adversary being faced today is not that Iran. It is an Iran that has spent years in intensive knowledge exchanged with a major military power, that has accumulated real operational experience in a live combat environment, and that has developed drone production capabilities at a scale and a cost point that fundamentally changes the economics of the attacker-defender relationship in ways that make every existing defense investment less effective than its specifications suggest. Here's the economics that matters most. A Patriot interceptor missile costs between $2 and $4 million. The Iranian drones it is being used to intercept cost between $20,000 and $50,000 each. That is a cost ratio of somewhere between 40 to 1 and 200 to 1 in favor of the attacker. Sustained at scale over a prolonged conflict, that ratio is not just a financial disadvantage. It is a strategic defeat in slow motion, because the defender's magazine, the total number of interceptors available, is finite and expensive to replenish. The attacker's production capacity has been scaled specifically to exploit that asymmetry, to generate drones faster than the defender can replace interceptors. At some point in a sustained exchange, the math breaks down for the defender in a way that no amount of additional procurement can fix quickly enough to matter in the current engagement timeline. This is the fundamental strategic problem that the arms sales were never designed to solve. They were designed to solve the threat of a conventional Iranian military, an air force, an armored force, a naval surface fleet, using the technological parameters of conventional warfare that favored expensive, sophisticated American systems. They were not designed against a mass production drone strategy built around exploiting the cost asymmetry that makes every expensive interceptor vulnerable to being exhausted by cheap, numerous attackers. And the defense contractors who sold the systems knew that the threat was evolving in this direction. The research was available, the analysis existed, but the systems being sold were the systems for which procurement pipelines and production lines and profit margins were already established. And selling new answers to new threat paradigms is harder and slower and less immediately profitable than selling more of what has already been approved and contracted. 250 American organizations signed a letter to Congress. This coalition, broad enough to span ideological lines that rarely find common ground, made a single devastating mathematical argument to their elected representatives. In 6 days of active conflict, the United States government spent $11.3 billion. In 6 days. $11.3 billion is not an abstraction. It is more than the entire annual discretionary budget of multiple major federal agencies. It is money that, the letter argued with specific citations, was being redirected away from domestic priorities, from food assistance programs serving millions of American families, from affordable housing initiatives, from infrastructure investment, from the science and technology research that is supposed to secure America's long-term economic competitiveness. And the signatories of that letter demanded that their elected representatives answer a question that the system of democratic accountability is supposed to be able to answer. Who decided to spend this money? What was the decision-making process? What specific security outcomes were purchased, and how do we know the purchase was worth the price? And if this conflict continues for 60 days instead of 6, what does the final bill look like? The fact that 250 organizations felt compelled to sign that letter in the first days of the conflict tells you something important about where American domestic political tolerance for open-ended military spending in the Middle East actually stands. It tells you that the assumption many policymakers have operated under, that the American public will support Gulf security commitments because they understand that Gulf energy stability is in the American national interest, is being tested against a domestic political reality in which the immediate, visible cost of that commitment has become large enough and fast enough to generate organized opposition at a scale and speed that has surprised observers across the political spectrum. 6 days, $11.3 billion. 11 point. And those are only the costs that can be quantified in government spending figures. The economic costs borne by the broader American and global economy, the oil price increases, the supply chain disruptions, the market volatility, the insurance premium increases, the corporate planning disruptions, are vastly larger and impossible to attribute to a single budget line. Which brings us to the final revelation, the one that the title of this video has been pointing toward from the very first frame, the F-35 betrayal. Because that phrase is not about any single aircraft or any single arms deal, it is about the gap, the fundamental, documented, consequential gap between what was sold and what was delivered, between the promise of the security architecture and its performance when the test actually came. The Gulf states were sold a guarantee. Not implicitly, not with fine print caveats about the limitations of military technology against asymmetric threats, a guarantee. The arms deals came with security commitments. The security commitments came with political language about American resolve and American capability and American partnership that left the Gulf states with every reasonable basis to believe that the investment they were making was buying them a level of protection that would hold against the realistic threats they faced. They were told that the technology was capable, the deterrence was credible, and the American commitment was real. The technology is extraordinary in the domains it was designed for. Nobody is disputing the engineering achievement of the F-35 or the Patriot system or any of the other platforms that make up the Gulf security architecture. These are genuinely impressive military systems. They just are not the right systems for the threat that materialized. And the question that 250 organizations are asking in Washington, and that finance ministers across the Gulf are asking in closed-door sessions, and that ordinary people are beginning to ask as they watch their energy bills rise and their grocery costs climb and their pension funds swing with Middle East volatility, is whether the people who sold the wrong systems against the right threat knew that they were doing it. The answer to that question is not clean. It is not a simple story of deliberate deception. It is a more complicated and in some ways more disturbing story of a system, an industry, a bureaucracy, a political economy of defense procurement that had structural incentives to emphasize certain threats and discount others, to sell the systems it already produced rather than develop the systems the threat actually required, to maintain the fiction that the existing architecture was adequate, because the cost of admitting otherwise was too high for too many people who profited from the status quo. It is a story of institutional failure compounded by financial incentive, compounded by political convenience, compounded by a media ecosystem that found it easier and more profitable to cover the latest arms deal signing ceremony than to interrogate whether the arms being dealt were matched to the threats being faced. And now the bill is due, in the most direct and undeniable terms, in burning refineries and stopped tankers and missile alerts on civilian phones and stock market volatility that is wiping value from retirement accounts across the world. In a letter signed by 250 organizations asking questions that were always worth asking, but that nobody with institutional power found it convenient to answer. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. The diplomatic channels that might produce de-escalation exist, but are under extraordinary stress. The domestic political pressure inside Iran, operating under new leadership, wounded literally and figuratively, is pushing toward continued demonstration of resolve rather than negotiated quiet. The Russia-Iran partnership gives Tehran a degree of external support and strategic cover that previous episodes of Gulf conflict did not feature. The global economic consequences of sustained disruption are accumulating in ways that create their own pressures toward resolution, but also their own risks of cascading crisis if resolution comes too slowly. What is not uncertain is what this episode has revealed: the gap between the promise of the Gulf security architecture and its actual performance against the actual threat. The cost of building a defense system against the wrong enemy while the right enemy built the right weapons. The price of an arms industry that was too profitable to be honest about its limitations. And the arithmetic of 6 days and $11.3 billion that every person who pays taxes and buys food and heats a home is now, in one way or another, contributing to paying. The reckoning has arrived, and it is only just beginning. Stay subscribed. Stay paying attention. Because the developments that will determine whether this conflict escalates into something historically unprecedented or finds a pathway toward resolution are going to move fast. And the details that matter most are going to be the ones buried deepest in the official statements and the press briefings and the carefully managed information environment that governments on all sides are trying to maintain. The story of what is actually happening, not what is being announced, but what is actually happening, is the story worth following. And it is the story we will keep telling. The world is at an inflection point that did not arrive by accident. It arrived through decisions, incentives, and failures of honesty that stretched across years and administrations and defense procurement cycles and diplomatic agreements that were worth less than the paper they were signed on. Understanding how we got here is the first step toward understanding how we get out. And that understanding starts with one simple, devastating, unanswerable number. 6 days, $11.3 billion, and 51 drones over Riyadh that were destroyed, every one of them, and still taught Iran exactly what it needed to know. That is the story. That is the betrayal. And now you know it. But before we reach that final reckoning, there's one more dimension of this story that demands honest examination. One more layer beneath the military strategy and the economic disruption and the diplomatic failure. The human dimension. Not the casualties. We will not traffic in the graphic details that belong to a different kind of coverage. The human dimension of what it means to live in a city that just discovered its untouchability was a marketing proposition. What it means to be an executive who relocated your family to Dubai because you were told it was the safest city in the region. What it means to be a Qatari policymaker who spent a career building diplomatic relationships with Tehran, precisely to prevent the thing that just happened. What it means to be a Saudi air defense operator who intercepted 51 drones in one night and knows, because you understand the doctrine better than the press briefing writers do, that you just ran the most expensive training exercise Iran has ever conducted against your systems. And they learned from every single one of those intercepts. The psychological dimension of this crisis is real and consequential in ways that shape decisions and behaviors that then have further economic and geopolitical consequences. Confidence is not a soft metric. In the context of a regional economy built on attracting international capital and corporate presence and long-term investment, confidence is the most important asset on the balance sheet. And confidence, unlike oil infrastructure, does not have a straightforward repair timeline. You cannot send an engineering crew to fix confidence. You cannot announce a reconstruction contract that will restore it by a certain date. Confidence returns when people feel safe again. And people feel safe again when the underlying conditions that made them feel unsafe have genuinely and demonstrably changed. Those conditions have not changed. They are still evolving. And the direction of the evolution is not yet clear. Meanwhile, the clock on the economic damage is running without pause. Every day that tanker traffic in the Strait of Hormuz remains below its normal volume is a day that the cumulative shortfall in energy delivery grows larger. Every day that Qatari LNG production is below its contracted delivery levels is a day that the force majeure protections are being invoked and that the contractual relationships underpinning the global LNG market are under stress. Every day that the war risk insurance premium for a Gulf voyage remains at its current elevated level is a day that more commercial operators are calculating that the economics of operating in the region do not work and extending their operational suspensions further into the future. There is a feedback dynamic here that analysts of previous oil crises will recognize immediately. When energy prices rise because of a supply disruption, the economies most dependent on that energy slow down. When those economies slow down, their demand for other goods and services from around the world falls. When demand from major economies falls simultaneously, the countries that export goods to those economies see their own revenues fall. The disruption that begins in a 21-mile strait propagates outward through the global economic system along the trade and financial relationships that connect every economy on Earth to every other economy. And it does so with a momentum that grows faster than any individual government can respond to with policy interventions. This is what economists mean when they talk about contagion, not a metaphor. A mechanical reality of how interconnected economic systems respond to localized shocks that are large enough to move the variables that other parts of the system depend on. The governments of the Gulf know this. The government of the United States knows this. The governments of Europe and Japan and South Korea and China know this. Every relevant decision maker in every relevant capital understands that a prolonged disruption to Gulf energy flows carries consequences that will not be contained to the Gulf, that will not be absorbed painlessly, and that will generate domestic political costs in every economy that depends on affordable energy to function. That shared understanding is the most powerful force pushing toward de-escalation. Not principle, not diplomacy, not international law, economics. The shared, visceral awareness that the longer this continues, the larger the bill becomes, and the more of that bill lands on populations that did not choose this conflict and did not vote for the decisions that produced it. Whether that shared understanding translates into the specific diplomatic and political decisions needed to produce a credible de-escalation pathway is the question that will determine whether the next chapter of this story is a managed resolution or an escalation into something that none of the histories of previous Middle East crises can serve as a useful guide for navigating. Because none of the previous crises featured the combination of factors that this one does. A Russian-Iranian operational partnership that is explicitly aimed at exploiting Western strategic overextension. An Iranian leadership that has been publicly humiliated and physically wounded, and that is operating under internal political pressure that makes restraint politically costly. A Gulf security architecture that has been publicly tested and found to have gaps that its architects never honestly disclosed. A domestic American political environment in which the financial cost of engagement has become visible fast enough and large enough to generate immediate organized opposition. And a global economic system that entered this crisis already stressed by years of post-pandemic disruption, and that has significantly less capacity to absorb additional shocks than it would have had 5 years ago. These factors together create a situation that is genuinely without precise historical precedent, which means that the models and the playbooks and the historical analogies that policymakers and analysts reach for when trying to navigate it are less reliable guides than they would be in a more familiar crisis. The uncertainty is real. The stakes are real. And the gap between the world that the defense deals promised and the world that the defense deals delivered is real, documented, and now visible to anyone who is paying honest attention. 250 organizations signed that letter. $11.3 billion in 6 days. 51 drones over Riyadh. A missile alert in Dubai. A burning refinery in Bahrain. A betrayed ally in Qatar. A silent strait. And a supreme leader who was wounded and who will spend every remaining day of his leadership proving that the Islamic Republic cannot be humiliated into submission. This is the world that the arms deals built. This is the security architecture in action. This is the F-35 betrayal in full. Not one aircraft, not one deal. An entire system of promises that the people making them knew, or should have known, they could not keep. The reckoning is here. The question is what we build when it is over, and whether the people who built the system that failed will be honest enough about why it failed to build something better. Or whether the incentives and the profits and the institutional momentum will once again produce a new architecture of impressive-sounding promises calibrated to the threats of the last war rather than the war that is coming. That is the question worth asking. That is the story worth following. And that is why you need to know what is happening right now in the skies over the Gulf and the quiet waters of the most important strait in the world. Stay informed. The next chapter starts now.